How's it going, folks? Welcome back to another one of my top 5 videos here on YouTube. Today, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 cards from Modern Horizons 2 that recently released that I think would make excellent additions to Historic on Magic Arena. Before I dive into my top 5 picks, I would like to say there's probably a dozen or maybe even a couple dozen new sweet designs in this set that I think would be sweet additions. In fact, I think you could probably create an entire Historic anthology from new designs in this set to inject into Historic. But let's get right to the 5 that I like the most and talk about why I think they would make a positive impact to the format. Coming in at number 5, we have the sea and the sky here. This design, in and of itself, I think serves to solve a lot of the problems these creature decks frequently tend to have in formats like Historic. The big issue these creature decks have in my experience is that they just can't beat Wrath of God. A lot of the times you're just like crossing your fingers and hoping that your opponent doesn't have it. Even if you're in blue like merfolk frequently are, it's difficult to hold up a spell pierce or a miscast on turns 1, 2, and 3. So especially if you're on the draw, you usually don't have the ability to both hold up disruption and add meaningful pressure to the table. Sea in the Sky kind of changes that. So this has indestructible if you have at least 2 other merfolk, which means if you play this out on the 3rd turn after curving 1 and 2, and your opponent casts a Wrath of God on their turn 4, this is going to survive. And then whenever this attacks, we get to draw a card, which means you recover from a sweeper well, and your other merfolk have ward 1, which means your opponent has to pay 1 extra mana in order to target them. So it helps keep your creatures safe from spot removal as well. This very importantly has a 4th point of toughness, which means this card doesn't die to Lightning Helix while simultaneously protecting the rest of your fish from Lightning Helix. And I think that there's a good chance that this card alone could push merfolk in Historic from being, not even a B-list player to being a very reasonable deck in the format. So I think it would be a great addition. Coming in at number 4 on my Modern Horizon 2 cards I'd like to see added to Historic, we have Priest of Fell Rites. We very recently saw Elish Norn and the other Praetors get added to the format, kind of giving people incentive to kind of work with Unburial Rites Reanimator style decks. And as someone who's played a number of iterations of those decks so far, I think there's two ways in which they come up short. The first is that they lack consistency because you can only play 4 copies of Unburial Rites. You'll very frequently have a ability to reanimate like an Elish Norn or a Jin-Gitaxias, but you haven't found one of your Unburial Rites. And the fact that this has Unearth means that this is basically 4 more copies of a reanimate spell that you can Grizzly Salvage into. The second is that some of the aggressive decks in the format can frequently get under you, especially when you're on the draw. Being able to reanimate Elish Norn on turn 4 can frequently be too slow. And this card lets you theoretically reanimate on turn 3, but it does so in a way that's incredibly fair, right? Like, this is an activated ability, which means this creature has to not have summoning sickness, which means that, a deck like Gruul, for example, has an opportunity to stomp this before you get to go ahead and do your thing on turn 3. So this forces your opponent to be interactive, but can also punish them if they're just trying to linear you by letting you get to your game plan faster. So I feel like this card would really solve potentially 2 of the big problems that the Reanimator archetypes have in this format. Speaking of the Reanimator archetypes, at number 3, I have another card that I would like to see added that I think would be great for that archetype, and that's Kind of Cruelty. I think this card does a really sweet job of generating value and being a generically good must answer threat that you could bring back with Unburial Rites or something like Priest of Fell Rites, but it's not quite a Gristle brand level of offensive like we see in Legacy and Modern. So it's just a good card that generates some advantage. So if your opponent, has cast down or removal spell right away, you're not super sad that you reanimated and it didn't do anything. You still drew a card, they discarded a card, so you generated some value with it. And it also eventually ends the game while accruing incremental value if your opponent is unable to answer it right away. Coming in at number 2 on the Modern Horizons 2 cards I'd like to see added to Historic, we have Grist the Hunger Tide. I really must say that the newest Planeswalker designs that Wizards of the Coast has been coming up with, especially in these supplemental non-standard sets, have just been They're just incredibly sweet designs. I'm so glad we've gotten past the, 5 mana Planeswalker +1 card advantage, -3 removal ultimate that wins the game. And this one's super unique. As long as it isn't on the battlefield, it is a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. So this is a Planeswalker you can collected company into, which is just super sweet. It protects itself on its +1, potentially generating multiple insects. It also has kind of a pseudo sub build around theme if you have other insect cards you can work with. It allows you to be interactive. You have other things worth sacrificing, so perhaps this could be good. We've seen, for example, the Jund Company sacrifice deck get pushed out of the format in favor of the bigger food variation, and this could potentially bring that variation, that archetype, maybe back up into prominence because it's an interactive piece that you can collected company into. And then the bottom part there, while not guaranteed to win the game, it's frequently going to do something very reasonable, especially if you're pairing it in a deck that has a lot of creatures for collected company in it. Coming in at number 1, speaking of sweet Planeswalker designs, we have Decon the Shadow Slayer. And this one is sweet. The scaling loyalty based on how long the game has been going on is really a design that I like. Notably, on turn 3, you can just play this effectively as a exile target creature, sorcery speed removal spell. Surveil 2 means perhaps we could see it in some kind of graveyard value shell. For those not familiar with that keyword, Surveil is like Scry, only instead of putting the cards at the bottom, they get put into your graveyard. So this works with things like Search for Azcanta. Esper as a shard is one that we see really struggle in Historic, especially with Jeskai getting powerful tools like Lightning Helix and having access to a Triumph. I think putting a card like this into the format that would incentivize people to push into a different color direction with their 3-color control decks would be sweet to see. The ultimate on this is kind of meh. But honestly, I think what you would be playing this card for in the average control deck, the card selection from Surveil, as well as the removal on the down tick, is really what you would want access to this for. So what'd you think of my top 5 list here? Are there other cards for Modern Horizons that you would like to see added? Modern Horizons 2 that you'd like to see added to the platform? If you were going to have an entire Modern Horizons 2 anthology, what cards would you like to see in that past just the 5 that I listed here today? Personally, I wouldn't mind getting a whole bunch of sweet squirrel cards to play Squirrel Tribal in this format. A lot of excellent designs there. And honestly, a lot of sweet tribal things in general. At any rate, thanks for watching my top 5 video here today. Remember, if you're interested in more of these, you can check them out. We have about half a dozen of them up on the channel now. And I'll be back tomorrow morning with not only more live Historic content on Twitch, but we'll also be getting our installment of Meta Monday. We'll be breaking down everything that happened at the Strixhaven Championship this weekend, which was Historic in addition to Standard. So thanks for watching, folks, and hopefully catch you around again real soon.